The silence was the most unnerving part, a profound and absolute emptiness that the hum of the Stella Seeker's life support couldn't quite fill. It was the silence of a graveyard, and a stillness that clung to the ship like cosmic dust, a remnant of the Tartarus colony they had failed to save. Doctor, Eris Thorne felt that silence in his bones, a cold weight that had settled deep in his chest 3 days ago and refused to leave. From his post at the Xenolinguistics console, a station that had become tragically redundant, he watched the star-strewn void slide past the main viewport. They were running. Every soul aboard the repurposed geological surveyor knew it. Running from a foe that had no voice, no comms chatter, no declaration of war, only a perfect, horrifying silence as it unmade things. Eris had been on Tartarus when it happened, studying the resonant frequencies of pre-sentient crystalline lifeforms in the deep caves. He'd been cataloging their subsonic hums when the sky had simply stopped. The silence, as the terrified first contact reports had dubbed them, didn't arrive in ships of steel and fire. They manifested as distortions in space, crystalline lattices that shimmered at the edge of perception before resolving into impossible, geometric shapes. They didn't fire lasers or launch missiles. They projected fields of absolute stillness, zones where the fundamental laws of physics seemed to fray and dissolve. Buildings, people, atmosphere, it all just ceased to be, crumbling into inert particles without a sound. He had been one of the lucky 200 evacuees. A civilian specialist swept up with the retreating garrison and crammed aboard the Stella Seeker, the only FTL-capable vessel at the colony. Now, his academic knowledge felt like a useless trinket in the face of an existential threat. His reflection in the darkened console glass showed a man hollowed out by what he'd seen. Dark circles under eyes that had once held intellectual curiosity now held a haunted watchfulness, and his jaw was set in a permanent clench. He shared the bridge with the ship's skeleton crew, a professional cadre of fleet officers who moved with a strained, brittle efficiency. Presiding over them all was Commander Eva Rostova, a woman who seemed carved from granite and pragmatism. She stood ramrod straight near the command chair, her gaze fixed on the star chart projected in the center of the bridge, a shimmering blue map of their desperate flight path back toward the core worlds. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her expression was a mask of control. But Eris could see the tension in the corded muscles of her neck. She tolerated his presence on her bridge out of necessity. He was the closest thing to an expert on alien phenomena they had, even if his expertise felt woefully inadequate. Status update. Rostova's voice was crisp, cutting through the low thrum of the ship. Lieutenant Jian Li, the navigation officer, answered without turning from her controls. Course remained steady. Commander, we are holding at 92% of maximum sustainable velocity, and the drive core is stable. But Chief Tanaka reports she's running hot. Recommends we drop to 85% for a cooling cycle within the next 12 hours. Rostova's lips thinned. 12 hours we don't have. Maintain current speed. What about our pursuers? The tactical officer, a young ensign named Corbin, flinched almost imperceptibly. The word pursuers was too simple for what followed them. No direct sensor contact. Ma'am, but the quantum wake is still there. Unchanged. They're matching our speed perfectly. In a ripple of unease passed through the bridge. The silence didn't chase in a conventional sense. They left a trail, a subtle disturbance in the fabric of space-time, like a shark moving under deep water. You couldn't see them, but you knew they were there, pacing you, tireless and inevitable. Eris turned his attention back to his own console, running the sensor logs from the fall of Tartarus for the 100th time. He wasn't a soldier or a strategist, But he was a scientist, and science began with observation. The data was sparse, corrupted by the very phenomena he was trying to study, but there were patterns, faint signatures hidden within the noise. Just before each structure on Tartarus had been unmade, the local ambient energy field had fluctuated in a specific way, a cascade of resonant frequencies that climbed the harmonic scale before suddenly cutting off. It wasn't an energy weapon signature, it was something else, something more fundamental. It was as if the silence were tuning their attack, finding the precise vibration of their target and then canceling it out. He was so absorbed in the cascading numbers that he almost missed the change in the bridge's atmosphere. The low hum of the ship seemed to deepen, and a strange, almost subsonic vibration tickled at the edge of his hearing. Lieutenant Lee swore under her breath. "Commander, I'm detecting something ahead of us." Rostova was at her side in an instant, her calm facade cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Define something, Lieutenant." "It's a gravimetric anomaly, ma'am. Massive. We're still 2 light minutes out, but it's blocking our path." On the main view screen, the star chart dissolved, replaced by a visual feed from the long-range telescope. At first, there was nothing but the familiar tapestry of distant stars. Then, as the sensors enhanced the image, a darkness appeared. It wasn't the absence of light, like a nebula or the shadow of a rogue planet. It was an active, hungry void, a patch of space where the stars behind it were not merely blocked, but warped, their light bending around an object of immense gravitational pull. They were being herded. The chilling realization struck Eris with the force of a physical blow. The chase hadn't been a chase at all. It was a hunt, and the silence had just closed the trap. "Evasive maneuvers," Rostova snapped. "Bring us about. Find another route." "There is no other route. Commander." Lee's voice was tight with panic. "The anomaly is growing, expanding. It's cutting off all viable FTL exit vectors. It's like the ones from Tartarus, but bigger." Eris felt his blood run cold. He stumbled over to the main screen, his eyes wide as he processed the telemetry scrolling at the side. The energy signature was identical, the harmonic prelude, the climbing frequencies, it was all there, but amplified 1,000-fold. This wasn't a ship, it was a nest, a colossal crystalline structure that must have been the size of a small moon, and it was calving, shedding smaller distortions like spores. They had run from a pack of wolves straight into the Leviathan's maw. "They knew," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "They knew where we were going." Rostova shot him a sharp, questioning look. "Explain, Doctor." He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "This isn't a random encounter. They didn't just follow us. They anticipated us. They understand FTL travel. They calculated our trajectory, and they set this trap. This is not a mindless force of nature, Commander. This is an intelligence." His words hung in the air, heavier than any physical threat. A mindless monster was one thing. A calculating, hyper-intelligent predator was another entirely. Rostova's face was pale, but her voice was a rock. "Tactical. Give me an estimate." "How long until those smaller vessels are within effective range?" Corbin swallowed hard. "Their effective range appears to be whatever they want it to be. Ma'am, on Tartarus, they engaged from orbit. Based on their current rate of deployment, I'd say we have less than an hour. An hour. 60 minutes until the Stella Seeker was unmade. The finality of it was suffocating. Rostova's mind was clearly working, running through the limited, hopeless options. Fight, their ship was armed with asteroid defense cannons and a single, outdated plasma turret. Useless. Run. There was nowhere to run. Her military training had no protocol for this. Eris's mind, however, was racing down a different path. A path forged not by tactics, but by theory. The resonance. The patterns. It was all a form of communication. A language spoken not with words, but with the fundamental frequencies of the universe. The silence didn't just destroy things. They resonated with them, understood their physical structure on a quantum level, and then broadcast a perfectly opposing wave. A nullification. It was the ultimate expression of linguistic dominance, to understand something so completely that you could command it to not exist. And if it was a broadcast, a wave, then it could be jammed. "Commander," Eris said, his voice surprisingly firm, "we can't outrun them, and we can't fight them with conventional weapons. We have to try something else." Rostova turned to him. Her eyes narrowed. "I am not open to civilian suggestions at this moment. Dr. Thorne." "This isn't a suggestion," he shot back, his desperation overriding his usual deference. "It's a hypothesis. The only one we've got. Their weapon isn't energy or matter. It's resonance. A destructive frequency. If we can identify that frequency, we might be able to create a counter-frequency. A shield of disruptive sound." The commander stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "A shield of sound, Doctor. This is my ship, not one of your theoretical physics seminars. The Stella Seeker is a geological survey vessel. Is it not? Its primary instrument is the subsurface resonance imager. You use it to map planetary cores by broadcasting sympathetic vibrations and reading the echoes." He took a step closer, his voice dropping, intense and urgent. "That imager, your resonance engine, is the most sophisticated piece of sonic technology humanity has ever built. It's designed to generate and manipulate complex harmonic waves with pinpoint precision. It's not a weapon, Commander, but I think we can turn it into one." For the first time, a flicker of something other than grim duty crossed Rostova's face. It was a spark of desperate, unwilling consideration. She looked from Eris's wild, pleading eyes to the terrifying, growing darkness on the view screen. The logic was insane, a shot in the dark based on the theoretical ramblings of a civilian academic. But the alternative was silent, certain annihilation. "Chief Tanaka," she said into her comm, her voice betraying none of her internal conflict. "Report to the bridge. Immediately." Chief Engineer Kenji Tanaka arrived moments later, a compact man with grease-stained hands and weary eyes that had seen too many systems fail in the last 72 hours. He listened, his expression shifting from confusion to incredulity as Eris laid out his theory, gesturing frantically at the energy readings from Tartarus. "You want to what?" Tanaka finally interrupted, his voice strained. "Doctor, the resonance engine is a finely calibrated scientific instrument. It's designed to send out subtle pulses, not a continuous, high-energy wave. To generate the kind of power you're talking about, we'd have to bypass every safety protocol. We'd have to reroute the secondary drive core directly into the emitter array. The feedback alone could shatter the ship's keel. The engine would tear itself apart. But it's possible," Eris pressed, his heart hammering. Tanaka hesitated, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Theoretically, if the harmonic dampeners hold, and if the power conduits don't melt, and if the focusing crystal doesn't fracture into a million pieces, then yes, for a few seconds, it might be possible. But the power drain would be catastrophic. We'd have to divert everything. shields, non-essential life support, even the inertial dampeners. Rostova stepped forward, her gaze locking onto her chief engineer. Kenji, give me the odds. Tanaka looked at the floor, then at Eris, and finally at his commander. The odds of the engine firing successfully? Maybe 30%. The odds of us surviving the attempt, even if it works, lower. The bridge fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the quiet of a choice being weighed, the fate of 300 souls balanced against a madman's theory. Eris held his breath. He saw the struggle in Rostova's eyes, the conflict between her duty to preserve the lives of her crew and the dawning realization that preservation might no longer be an option. Survival might demand a different, more terrible price. The colossal silent anomaly on the view screen seemed to pulse, a silent, patient god of destruction. Finally, Rostova turned away from the screen, her back to the abyss, and faced her crew. Her face was a mask of cold resolve. The decision made. "Mr. Corbin," she said, her voice like ice. "Open a ship-wide channel. Lieutenant Lee, keep us steady. Hold this position." She then turned her gaze to Tanaka and Eris, and in her eyes, Eris saw that she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer a captain trying to save her ship. She was a commander waging a war with the only weapon she had. "Chief?" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt or fear. "You have your orders. Take Dr. Thorne to engineering and turn his theory into a miracle. You have 55 minutes. The journey from the bridge to engineering was a descent into the belly of the beast, a passage through the layers of the Stella Seeker's own desperate anatomy. Eris followed Tanaka through humming corridors where the standard white lighting had been replaced by the stark, blood-red glow of combat readiness. Crew members and the few civilian evacuees they pass flatten themselves against the bulkheads, their faces a mixture of disciplined fear and raw panic. Eris saw it all, the young ensign whose hands trembled as he checked a power conduit, the medic running toward the small infirmary with a kit, the hollow-eyed family of a geologist from Tartarus huddled in an alcove while clutching one another as if their combined grip could hold the universe at bay. Each face was a testament to the lives resting on his unproven, insane theory. He was a linguist, a man of abstract thought and quiet study, now striding towards a mechanical heart he barely understood to perform open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer. The weight of their gazes felt physical, a pressure on his shoulders that made his lab coat feel like a lead mantle. Tanaka, by contrast, seemed to draw strength from the ship's crisis. He moved with a purpose that bordered on predatory. His earlier weariness burned away by a surge of adrenaline and grim resolve. This was his domain, and it was under threat. He barked orders into his comm as they walked, a staccato language of power ratios, system overrides, and personnel assignments that Eris couldn't begin to parse. They reached the massive pressure door to engineering, and it hissed open to reveal a cavernous space that was a world away from the sterile quiet of the bridge. This was a cathedral of power, a multi-level chamber dominated by the pulsating, glowing core of the primary FTL drive, which thrummed with a bass note so low it vibrated in Eris's teeth. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and recycled coolant. A team of 6 engineers, Tanaka's hand-picked loyalists, turned as they entered, their faces slick with sweat and illuminated by the sparks showering from a console they were already attacking with plasma cutters. At the center of the upper gantry, suspended in a gyroscopic cradle, was the resonance engine. It was larger than Eris had imagined, a polished chrome sphere 20 feet in diameter, intricately webbed with conduits and emitters. At its core, Visible through a reinforced viewport was the focusing crystal, a flawless, fist-sized prism of synthesized quartz that was the single most valuable component on the ship. "You heard the commander." Tanaka's voice boomed over the roar of the drive core. "We're turning this rock thumper into a cannon. I want the secondary core's output shunted directly to the emitter array. Bypass the regulators, the safeties. All of it. I want every drop of power we have flowing into that crystal." One of the engineers, a woman with Sato stenciled on her jumpsuit, looked up from her work, her eyes wide. "Chief, the power conduits can't handle that load. They'll slag. We'll be lucky if we don't blow the whole deck." "Then we reinforce them," Tanaka shot back, grabbing a heavy-duty plasma welder. "We've got half a dozen spare coolant lines in storage. We'll braid them, use them as makeshift bus bars. It won't be pretty, but it might hold for the 5 seconds we need it to. Now move." The team sprang into action, a whirlwind of controlled chaos. They worked with a desperate synchronicity, tearing open floor plates to expose the ship's glowing arteries of power, shouting measurements and warnings to each other over the rising din. Eris felt utterly useless, an intruder in this world of practical, life-or-death mechanics. Tanaka seemed to sense it, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward a diagnostic station tucked away in a shielded alcove. "I need that frequency, Doctor," he said, his voice a low growl inches from Eris's ear. "My people are about to tear a hole in the laws of thermodynamics for you. Don't you dare let it be for nothing. This console is slaved to the long-range sensor array. It'll give you the raw resonance data from that thing out there. Find its voice, and then tell me how to scream back." Eris slid into the chair, his hands shaking as he pulled on a set of noise-canceling headphones and stared at the screen. The data was already pouring in, a chaotic waterfall of numbers and waveforms. He began to filter it, isolating the specific frequencies emanating from the silent nest. It wasn't a single note, it was a symphony of destruction. He could see the fundamental frequency, the deep, resonant hum that was the carrier wave. But layered on top of it were dozens, hundreds of shifting harmonics. It was a complex, adaptive signal, and as he watched, he saw it begin to change. The silence were probing them, listening to the Stella Seeker's energy signature, the hum of its engines, the faint resonance of its hull. They were learning the ship's song. Back on the bridge, Rostova stood like a statue, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the tactical display. The small, scattered dots of the silent vessels were no longer random. They were moving, coalescing into a deliberate geometric pattern around the Stella Seeker, a containment field, a cage. "Commander," Corbin reported, his voice strained. "They're forming a resonance net. Energy readings are climbing. It matches the final pattern from Tartarus. They're preparing to fire." Rostova keyed her comm. "Tanaka, status." "We're laying the last conduit now, Commander." His voice crackled back, tinny and distant over the roar of his work. 5 more minutes to full power, but the engine's crystal is already showing micro-fractures from the ambient resonance. I don't know how long it will hold even before we fire." "You have 4 minutes," Rostova replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. She turned to the comms officer. "Ensign, activate ship-wide address." A soft chime echoed through the vessel, and then Rostova's voice, calm and unyielding, filled every corridor and cabin. "This is Commander Rostova. As you know, we are engaged with a superior hostile force. Our options are limited, and our chances of survival are negligible." She paused, letting the brutal honesty of her words sink in. There would be no false hope, no comforting lies. We are not a warship. We are engineers, scientists, and civilians. We are the crew of the Stella Seeker, and our mission has always been one of discovery. In the last hour, we have discovered the nature of our enemy. It is an enemy that seeks to unmake us, to erase us from existence in perfect silence. We cannot allow that. Our stand here, our final act, will not be silent. Her voice hardened, taking on a new edge of fierce, defiant pride. Engineering is preparing a response, a final broadcast from this vessel. It may be our last, but let it be heard. Let the universe know that humanity was here, that we did not break, that we did not bow, and that we did not go quietly. Rostova out. A profound quiet followed her words, a shared moment of grim acceptance that was more powerful than any cheer. They were going to die, but they were going to die on their own terms. In engineering, the final, makeshift power conduit was magnetically clamped into place. It was a monstrous, ugly thing, a twisted braid of repurposed piping that glowed ominously as the secondary core began to channel its power. The lights in the chamber flickered and dimmed as every non-essential system on the ship was sacrificed to feed the resonance engine. The air crackled with stray energy, and the deck plates hummed with a dangerous, rising vibration. "Power is shunted, Chief," Sato yelled over the noise. "The array is hot." Tanaka watched the temperature gauges for the focusing crystal spike into the red. "Eris, now," he bellowed. "I need the counter frequency. The crystal is about to tear itself apart." Eris stared at the screen, his mind a maelstrom of data. The silent song was reaching its crescendo, a complex chord of annihilation. He could see the final sequence they were building, the nullification wave that would unmake the Stella Seeker. It was elegant, perfect, and utterly lethal. But in its perfection, he found a flaw. It was a closed system, a loop. To create the nullification, they had to create a perfect mirror of their target's resonance, and in doing so, they had exposed their own. They had broadcast the key to their own undoing. It was a desperate gamble, a theoretical leap based on a ghost in the machine, but it was all he had. "It's not a counter frequency," Eris breathed into his microphone, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's a feedback loop. We don't scream back at them. We echo their own scream back at them, but amplified and inverted. We have to become a perfect mirror." He worked with a speed he didn't know he possessed, his fingers flying across the console, translating his breakthrough into a programmable sequence of harmonic waves. He was no longer a linguist. He was a composer, writing a single durable chord that would either save them or be the last thing he ever created. "Uploading the sequence now," he yelled. It's unstable. The math is, it's not meant to exist." "Nothing about this is meant to exist," Tanaka roared back. He slammed a protective blast shield over the alcove where Eris worked. "It's uploaded, Commander," he shouted into his comm. "The engine is primed and ready on your mark. On the bridge." The main view screen showed the space around the Stella Seeker beginning to shimmer, to distort, as the silence invisible net tightened and the ship groaned, the very atoms of its hull protesting the unnatural forces closing in. A hairline crack appeared in the reinforced viewport, spreading like a spider's web. "Dr. Thorne," Rostova's voice was impossibly calm over the comm. "Are you certain?" Eris watched the cascade of numbers on his screen, the final, lethal chord of the silence locking into place. He took a steadying breath, the smell of burning ozone sharp in his nostrils. his theory, his miracle, his funeral pyre. "Yes, Commander," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I am." Rostova looked at the shimmering void, at the face of a silent, merciless god. Then she looked at the cracked viewport, at her ship, her crew, her final, defiant stand. Her hand tightened on the command chair. "All hands, brace for impact," she ordered. Then, her voice ringing like a final bell through the dying ship, she gave the command. Engage. In the heart of engineering, Tanaka slammed his palm down on the firing control, a large, red button that had been hastily jury-rigged onto the main console. For a microsecond, nothing happened. The cacophony of the dying ship continued unabated, the shriek of stressed metal, the scream of overloaded conduits, the deep, gut-wrenching thrum of the two drive cores being bled dry. Eris, shielded in his alcove, felt a profound, bottomless dread pool in his stomach. It had failed. The math was wrong. The conduits had melted. The theory was nothing but the desperate fantasy of a doomed academic. And then the sound began. It was not a sound that entered through the ears, but one that was born in the bones, in the fillings of one's teeth. It was a pure, resonant tone that started as a low hum and climbed the harmonic scale with impossible speed. The entire ship became a tuning fork, vibrating with a power that threatened to tear it atom from atom. The chrome sphere of the resonance engine blazed with an almost blinding white light, raw energy arcing from its emitters to the reinforced walls of the chamber. Inside its core, the focusing crystal, already fractured, pulsed with an unholy luminescence, holding together for a few precious seconds against forces it was never designed to contain. Eris watched on his monitor as the energy output graph went completely vertical, shattering the limits of the display. The feedback loop he had designed, the perfect inverted mirror of the Silent's own destructive song, was being broadcast into the void. On the bridge, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. The shimmering distortion that had enveloped the Stella Seeker vanished, as if it had never been. The groaning of the hull ceased. The spiderweb crack on the viewport held, frozen in place. For a single, beautiful, terrifying moment, there was a perfect, unnatural stillness. And then, and through the viewport, they saw the echo, a wave of visible, shimmering force, a perfect sphere of golden light, erupted from the Stella Seeker, expanding outwards at the speed of light. It was not an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but an explosion of pure yet weaponized resonance. It was their scream, their final word, their defiance made manifest. The closest of the silent vessels, the crystalline geometric shapes that had been forming the cage, were the first to be struck. They did not explode. They simply ceased. One moment they were there, shimmering and malevolent, and the next they had dissolved into a cloud of inert, gray dust. Their own nullification frequency turned back on them, amplified 1,000-fold. The golden wave of resonance continued its silent, inexorable expansion. It swept through the silent fleet like a cosmic judgment. Ship after ship, lattice after lattice, unmade themselves, crumbling into cosmic dust. The intricate, intelligent patterns they had formed broke apart in a cascading failure of their own perfect logic. For the first time since humanity had encountered this foe, the silence of the silence was not the silence of a predator. It was the silence of the grave. On the bridge of the Stella Seeker, no one breathed. They watched the impossible unfold, their faces illuminated by the golden light of their own improbable salvation. Corbin stared at his tactical display, where hundreds of red hostile indicators were winking out of existence, one after another. Lieutenant Lee had her hands pressed against the viewport, her expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. Even Rostova, the woman of iron and pragmatism, allowed a single jarp exhale of disbelief to escape her lips. They had done it. The madman's theory had worked. But the cost was only just beginning to be counted. The golden light of the resonance engine faded as quickly as it had appeared, and in its place came a profound and catastrophic shutdown. Power across the ship died, not in a flicker, but in a sudden, brutal amputation. The main lights went out, plunging the bridge into the near-total darkness of the void, broken only by the faint, dying glow of a few emergency strips in the cold, distant light of the stars. The thrum of the main drive core coughed, sputtered, and died, replaced by a series of deep, metallic groans from the ship's tortured superstructure. Gravity failed. The crew, who had been bracing for a destructive impact, were suddenly weightless, floating in the sudden, eerie quiet. Rostova grabbed onto the railing of her command chair to keep from drifting away, her knuckles white. "Report!" she barked into the blackness, her voice unnaturally loud in the sudden, tomb-like silence. A moment passed. Then Corbin's voice came back, strained and shaky. I have nothing, Commander." "Tactical is offline. All primary systems are dark. We're running on the last dregs of battery backup." In engineering, the scene was one of utter devastation. The resonance engine was a blackened, smoking ruin. The chrome sphere was warped and buckled, its conduits melted into grotesque, metallic icicles. Through the now opaque viewport, Eris could see that the focusing crystal had not just fractured, it had vaporized. The chamber was filled with a thick, acrid smoke, and the only light came from the dull, cherry-red glow of the overloaded, makeshift bus bars. The deck plates were hot enough to melt the soles of their magnetic boots. Tanaka floated near the ruined engine, his face a mask of soot, his chest heaving as he stared at the carnage he had wrought. "Secondary core is offline," he reported over the comm, his voice a ragged whisper. "Primary is stable, but in complete shutdown. The safeties kicked in just before it went critical. I think the ship's keel is intact, but barely. We've sustained catastrophic damage to every primary power system." Eris unstrapped himself from his chair and pushed off, drifting through the smoke-filled chamber towards the chief engineer. The silence here was different from the silence of the bridge. It was the silence of a dead machine, punctuated by the faint, ominous ticking of cooling metal. He looked at the ruin of the engine, the instrument of their salvation and their doom. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and terror. He had stared into the heart of the enemy's language and taught it to commit suicide. "The silent fleet?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Are they gone?" It was Rostova who answered, her voice patching through the comms, faint and crackling. "The immediate threat is neutralized. Doctor, the majority of the fleet was destroyed. A few outlying vessels have retreated. They are pulling back at speed." Relief washed over Eris so powerfully his knees felt weak, even in zero gravity. They were alive. They had survived. But survival was a relative term. "Commander," Tanaka cut in, his voice all business again despite the disaster around them. "We are dead in the water. No propulsion, no FTL, and our life support is running on a battery that has maybe 10 hours of life left. The comms array is fried. We can't even send a distress signal. We won, but nobody knows it. And if we don't get these systems back online, we're just delaying the inevitable." The cold, hard reality settled over them all. They had won the battle, But they were now adrift in the middle of the cosmic ocean, in a ship that was little more than a coffin, with the sharks wounded but not entirely vanquished. Rostova's voice was a steady anchor in the floating chaos. "Chief, what do you need to get the primary core restarted? Give me the bare minimum." And Tanaka did a slow 360-degree turn, his eyes scanning the wreckage of his engine room. "A miracle. The primary ignition system is shot. The coolant pumps are fused. Half the control relays are melted slag. To even begin to fix it, I'd need to fabricate new parts. To do that, I need power. To get power, I need the core online." It's a closed loop from hell. Eris drifted over to a schematic that was still faintly illuminated on a backup monitor. His mind, no longer consumed with theoretical linguistics, began to process the new problem. It was a different kind of language, the language of systems, of power flow, of cause and effect. "What about the emergency solar sails?" he asked, pointing to a section of the ship's outer hull on the diagram. "They're for trickle charging the batteries if we're becalmed. They can't power a coffee maker, let alone a drive core ignition sequence." Tanaka grumbled, floating over to look. "They aren't meant to," Eris countered, his mind starting to connect disparate pieces of information. "But they are designed to draw ambient stellar radiation, the energy from our resonance blast. It didn't just vanish. A lot of it was absorbed by the dust clouds, the remnants of the silent ships. That dust is now highly energized. It's not just inert particles. It's a low-level plasma field." Tanaka stared at him, then at the schematic. A slow, dawning comprehension spread across his grimy face. "You're saying we could use the sails to harvest the ghosts of the things we just killed?" "It would be a trickle," Eris admitted. "But if we reroute every last bit of that power, not to the batteries, but directly to the ignition capacitor for the main drive, it might be enough to give it a single, powerful jolt, enough to kickstart the system." It was another long shot, another theory plucked from the edge of desperation, but it was a plan, and a plan was hope. "Lee!" Rostova's voice came over the comm, clearly having heard the exchange. "Can you give me an orientation? Can we align the solar arrays with the densest part of that debris field?" A pause. Then the navigator's strained voice. "Commander, the maneuvering thrusters are offline. We are drifting. I have no control over our attitude. We're tumbling. Very slowly." The sliver of hope seemed to vanish. They had a potential power source, but no way to aim for it. The ship was a bottle, and the life-giving stream was just outside, forever out of reach. Rostova was silent for a long moment. Eris could picture her on the darkened bridge, floating in the void, the weight of their impossible situation then pressing down on her. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but it held a new kind of resolve. Not the resolve of a commander fighting a war, but the resolve of a survivor refusing to die. "Tanaka," she said, "get your team outside. I want you to rig the coolant lines. The ones you didn't use for the bus bars, turn them into makeshift thrusters. We're going to vent what's left of our reserve coolant and nitrogen. It won't be elegant, but it might be enough to stop our tumble. Dr. Thorne, you're with me. We need to calculate the precise vectors. We're going to nudge this wreck into position, one puff of gas at a time." It was the most audacious, insane, and brilliant plan Eris had ever heard. They were going to perform celestial mechanics by hand, using garden hoses on a ship the size of a city block, to chase the ghosts of their vanquished enemies in a desperate bid for a single spark of life. As Tanaka began yelling orders to his shell-shocked engineers to suit up for EVA, Eris felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He was no longer just a passenger, a civilian specialist. He was part of the machine, a cog in the desperate, beautiful engine of survival. He had given them a voice to scream with. Now, he would help them find a way to breathe again. The exterior of the Seeker was a landscape of devastation. What had once been a sleek, functional hull of graphite composite was now a mangled canvas of scorched metal, gaping wounds, and crystallized stress fractures under the cold, uncompromising light of a distant blue giant. The ship looked less like a vessel and more like a derelict monument to a forgotten war. Two figures in bulky, white EVA suits moved across this scarred terrain, their movements slow and deliberate in the zero-gravity environment. One was Chief Tanaka, his suit marked with the bold red stripes of engineering. The other was Eris Thorne, his own suit a plain, unmarked civilian model that felt clumsy and alien. Magnetic boots kept them anchored to the hull as they worked, their only connection to the dying ship that was their entire world. Around them, the void was eerily beautiful. The dust clouds that had once been the silent fleet hung in space like shimmering, ghostly nebulae, catching the starlight and glowing with a faint, ethereal luminescence. This was the energy field Eris had theorized about, the lingering ghost of their victory, and it was their only hope. Their task was as delicate as it was dangerous. Tanaka, with the practiced ease of a man who knew his ship inside and out, was retrofitting the emergency coolant vents. He jury-rigged a series of high-pressure nozzles, connecting them via flexible conduits to the ship's main nitrogen reserves. It was primitive, brute force rocketry, controlled by a simple handheld actuator. "Okay, Doctor." Tanaka's voice crackled through Eris's helmet comm, the sound tinny and distant. "The math is on you. I'm just the guy with the glorified fire extinguisher. Where do you want this puff of air to go?" Eris clung to a handhold near the port solar array, his gaze fixed on a ruggedized tablet tethered to his wrist. On its screen was a complex navigational model he and Lieutenant Lee had built, a mess of vectors, rotational velocities, and mass calculations. They were tumbling, a slow, almost imperceptible spin that, if left unchecked, would keep the solar sails from ever achieving a stable orientation toward the densest part of the energy field. "We need to counter the primary rotation on the Z-axis," Eris said, his own voice sounding strange and breathless in his helmet. "The spin is centered near the aft cargo bay. We need to apply thrust from the forward port quarter. Give me a 3-second burst, now." Tanaka braced himself, and the nozzle out into the void, and squeezed the actuator. A silent, invisible jet of nitrogen erupted from the nozzle, the only evidence of its passing the faint shimmer of ice crystals instantly forming and dissipating in the vacuum. The massive ship shuddered, a deep, groaning vibration that traveled through the soles of Eris's boots and up his spine. It felt like nudging a sleeping whale with a canoe paddle. For a tense 30 seconds, Eris watched the telemetry on his tablet. The number shifted, agonizingly slowly. The relentless climb of their rotational velocity slowed, wavered, and then began to creep back in the opposite direction. "It's working," Eris breathed, a cloud of fog forming on the inside of his faceplate. "The rotation is countered. We're stable on that axis. Now for the pitch." For the next 2 hours, they repeated this painstaking, terrifying ballet. Eris would call out vectors and thrust durations, and Tanaka would fire the makeshift thrusters, nudging the colossal wreck through the void. It was a process of inches and degrees, where a single miscalculation could send them into an unrecoverable spin or waste their precious, finite supply of reaction mass. Down in the darkened, frigid bridge, Rostova and Lee watched it all on the few functioning external camera feeds. They were helpless observers, their fate in the hands of an engineer and a linguist playing God on the skin of their ship. "Solar array deployment commencing," Lee announced, her voice a low murmur in the quiet. On the hull, with a series of groaning shudder, the massive wing-like solar sails began to unfold from their recessed housings. Each sail was a kilometer-long sheet of gossamer-thin photovoltaic mesh designed to catch the faint light of distant stars. Now, they were being aimed at the glowing dust cloud. As the sails locked into place, a new reading appeared on Eris's tablet, a number that made his heart leap into his throat. "We have a charge," he yelled into the comm, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's a trickle, barely a few kilowatts, but it's there. The field is working, back in engineering." A single green light flickered to life on a dusty console. It was the indicator for the primary drive's ignition capacitor. A young engineer named Reyes, who had been monitoring the station, let out a whoop of joy that echoed through the dead chamber. "Commander, the capacitor is charging," she reported, her voice electric with hope. "Charge rate is slow. At this rate, ETA to minimum ignition charge is 6 hours. 6 hours." The words hung in the air, a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. 6 hours until they could attempt to restart the heart of the ship. But their life support batteries only had 4 hours of power remaining. Rostova processed the information with her usual unnerving calm. "Understood, Reyes," she said. "Dr. Thorne, Chief Tanaka, get back inside. We need to conserve every bit of power we have. That includes the comms and the magnetic clamps on your boots." The return journey felt different. The ship was no longer just a tomb. It was a patient on the operating table, its lifeblood slowly, painstakingly being transfused from the ghosts of its enemies. Once they were back inside the airlock, the brutal reality of their countdown began. To conserve power, Rostova ordered a complete shutdown of all non-essential systems. This included the remaining emergency lights, the climate controls, and, most terrifyingly, the circulation fans for the life support system. The ship was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The air grew stale, then thick with the tang of carbon dioxide. The temperature began to plummet, the residual heat of the ship bleeding away into the void. They were a handful of survivors in a tin can, adrift in an infinite freezer, slowly suffocating in their own exhalations. Eris found himself on the bridge, huddled with Rostova, Lee, and Corbin. They wore emergency breathers, but thin masks that covered their mouths and noses and recycled a small amount of air. But they did little to combat the growing cold and the oppressive darkness. Their only light was the faint, ghostly glow of the starfield outside the viewport and the single green charging indicator on the tactical console, a lonely beacon in the gloom. Silence descended, a heavy, waiting silence. There were no more brilliant theories to be had, Vyasoid, no more heroic feats of engineering to perform. There was only the slow, agonizing crawl of a single green bar on a display. To pass the time, to fight off the cold and the encroaching despair, they began to talk, not as officers and a civilian, but as people staring into the abyss. Lee spoke of her home on Europa, of wanting to see the bioluminescent forest beneath the ice one last time. Corbin, the young tactical officer who had seen his entire world of rules and protocols dissolve, confessed that he had joined the fleet to escape a small, boring life on a farming moon, and now he would give anything to be back there, covered in dirt. Eris, prompted by Rostova's quiet, surprisingly gentle questions, found himself talking about his own past. He spoke of his fascination with language, the idea that every culture, every species, even every physical law, was a form of communication waiting to be deciphered. "I always believed," he said, his voice muffled by the breather mask, his words forming small clouds of vapor in the frigid air, "that if we could just understand the language of the universe, we could solve any problem. I never thought the solution would be to teach it how to scream." Rostova listened, a dark shape in the deeper darkness. When Eris finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her own voice softer than he had ever heard it. "My father was a shipbuilder," she said. "He taught me that every vessel has a spirit, a voice. He said that a commander's job wasn't just to command it, but to listen to it, to understand what it needed." The Stella Seeker, she was never meant to be a warship. She was built to explore, to learn. You didn't teach her to scream, Doctor. You gave her a voice to answer an existential question, and she answered it with defiance. Her words were a strange comfort, a reframing of their violent act not as a descent into brutality, but as an act of ultimate self-expression. They sat in the cold and the dark, their shared stories a small, flickering campfire against the encroaching night. The air grew thinner, the cold more biting. Eris could feel his thoughts slowing down, the effects of hypoxia setting in. He was on the verge of drifting into a dangerous, cold-induced sleep when a new sound broke the silence. A chime, soft but clear. On the tactical console, the green charging light had turned solid. Rhea's voice, weak but triumphant, crackled over the comm from engineering. "Commander, the capacitor is charged. We are ready to attempt ignition." And a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through Eris's fog. This was it, the final gamble. Rostova straightened up, her voice regaining its iron authority. A commander once more. "Tanaka, on my mark." A pause, then Tanaka's voice, raspy from the thin air. "Ready, Commander." "But if this doesn't work, the feedback will blow the entire drive section to hell. It's all or nothing." "It has always been all or nothing, Chief," Rostova replied. She looked out the viewport, at the silent stars and the ghostly dust that had given them this one last chance. "Engage in engineering, Tanaka," his face pale and his hands shaking from cold and oxygen deprivation, threw the final, heavy lever. For a heart-stopping second, the only sound was the clank of the metal. Then, a deep, resonant hum, a sound they had not heard in what felt like a lifetime, began to rise from the depths of the ship. The lights on the bridge flickered once, twice, then blazed to life, blindingly bright. The life support fans kicked in with a roar, and a wave of fresh, clean air washed over them. On the main screen, system after system switched from red to green. Main power online. Life support online. Propulsion standby. The Stella Seeker was alive. A ragged, exhausted cheer erupted on the bridge, a sound of pure, primal relief. Eris pulled off his breather and took a deep, shuddering breath of the clean, cool air. They had done it. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side. But as Lee brought the navigational charts back online, a new, cold dread began to settle in Eris's chest. The ship was alive, yes, but they were still hundreds of light years from friendly space, in a damaged vessel, with the chilling knowledge that some of the silent fleet had survived, had retreated. They had won the battle. He was starting to realize the war was far from over. The Stella Seeker was a ghost ship, crewed by ghosts. Though life support and power had returned, the vessel was a shadow of its former self, a wounded beast limping through the void. Entire sections of the hull were sealed off, too damaged to be reclaimed. The casualty list, once finalized, was a stark and brutal reminder of their victory's cost. 47 crew members and civilian evacuees had been lost, either during the silent attack or in the chaotic aftermath of the resonance blast. Their names scrolled on a memorial screen on the bridge, a silent, constant testament to the price of survival. The mood aboard was not one of triumphant celebration, but of grim, exhausted relief. They had faced the abyss and spat in its eye, but the abyss had stared back, and its reflection was now etched into the soul of every survivor. Eris found his role on the ship had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a civilian specialist. He was the man who had deciphered the enemy's soul, the architect of their impossible weapon. He was the Scream Maker, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. He spent his days not at the xenolinguistics console, but in the astrometrics lab with Lieutenant Lee, poring over the data from their encounter. The silent ships that had retreated had left a faint quantum wake, a trail far more subtle than the one that had led them into the trap. It was a breadcrumb, and it led out, away from the core worlds, into the uncharted black of the Perseus Veil. They weren't just passing through, Eris said, pointing to a projection showing the divergent FTL trajectories. This was a scouting force, a vanguard, the main body of their fleet, their civilization, if you can call it that, must be out there. The implication was chilling. They hadn't defeated an army, they had merely bloodied the nose of a single platoon. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. Commander Rostova, now faced with a long journey home, had become even more of a pragmatist. Her command was a delicate balancing act, maintaining military discipline while acknowledging the deep, collective trauma her crew had endured. Her primary concern was getting the Stella Seeker to the nearest friendly outpost, a journey that, even with the FTL drive operational, would take 3 weeks at their crippled top speed. One evening, she found Eris in the ship's small deceit, damaged arboretum. It had been his sanctuary on Tartarus, a place of quiet contemplation, and he had sought it out here. The blast had shattered most of the hydroponic domes, but a few resilient, genetically engineered Terran ferns had survived, their green fronds a stark contrast to the cold, gray metal of the ship. The fleet command is not going to believe your report. You know, she said, her voice softer than it was on the bridge. She stood near the entrance, her arms crossed, the memorial's soft light reflecting in her tired eyes. A weapon that uses resonance to unmake matter, a silent, crystalline enemy that anticipates FTL travel. They'll classify you as a madman and me as a fool who listened to him. The data doesn't lie, Eris replied, tracing the edge of a fern with his finger. The debris field, the energy signatures, the fact that the ship is still here when it shouldn't be. That's all the proof they should need. Proof can be inconvenient, Rostova countered. Admiralty thinks in terms of fleet strength, armor thickness, and weapon yields. You're asking them to fight a war with physics, not with battleships. They won't understand it. They will want to build bigger guns, not better tuning forks. She stepped closer, her gaze intense. But you and I, we understand. We've heard their song, and we know they're coming. When we get back, your fight is just beginning. You won't be fighting the silence. Doctor, you'll be fighting disbelief, bureaucracy, and fear. And her words were a prophecy, and they began to come true the moment the Stella Seeker limped into the orbit of Beacon, the outermost military listening post in the sector. They were met not with a hero's welcome, but with a quarantine, a fleet of sterile-looking medical frigates, and teams of tight-lipped intelligence officers who boarded their ship like an invading force. The crew was debriefed, psychologically evaluated, and effectively imprisoned in the station's medical wing. Eris's data, his logs, every piece of evidence he had painstakingly compiled was confiscated. He was subjected to days of grueling interrogations, his interrogators treating his theories about resonance and feedback loops as the stress-induced delusions of a traumatized civilian. They wanted to know about ship numbers, weapon types, things he couldn't provide. His truth was too alien, too outside their established paradigms of warfare. The official story began to solidify the Stella Seeker, through a heroic but conventional last stand, had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction in the enemy fleet's experimental power source. It was a fluke, a 1 in a billion lucky shot. The threat, while significant, was manageable. The Tartarus colony was declared a tragic loss, and a new defensive perimeter was established. They were burying the truth under a mountain of reports and commendations. Rostova, true to her word, fought for him. She backed his story, her official commander's log corroborating every impossible detail. But she was one voice against an entire military-industrial complex that had no framework for this new reality. They decorated her for her bravery and then quietly reassigned her to a desk job on a remote supply depot, a promotion that was, in effect, a silencing. It was there, in the sterile white confines of the Beacon Station, that despair finally found Eris. He had saved them all, had uncovered a truth that could save humanity, and he was being ignored. The screams of the Stella Seeker were being deliberately muffled by the very people he had fought to protect. He was sitting in the station's cold, impersonal library one day, idly scrolling through old physics journals, when a name caught his eye: Kenji Tanaka. After the debriefings, the chief engineer had been honorably discharged with a full pension, citing psychological distress, a quiet retirement. Another voice silenced. On a hunch, using a public terminal to avoid fleet oversight, Aris dug deeper. He found that Tanaka hadn't retired to a quiet beach somewhere. He had used his pension to set up a small, private research company, Resonant Dynamics. He wasn't the only one. Eris found others. Lieutenant Lee was now a senior lecturer in quantum astrophysics at a prestigious university. Ensign Corbin was working for a civilian defense contractor specializing in energy shielding. And Sato, the engineer from Tanaka's team, was heading a material science lab. They hadn't been silenced. They had been scattered, but they hadn't given up. They were continuing the work, in secret, on their own terms. Hope, fierce and defiant, sparked anew in Eris's chest. He used an encrypted channel, a method he'd learned from a paranoid colleague back on Tartarus, and sent a single, simple message to a public address he found for Tanaka's company. It contained only a string of numbers, the core harmonic sequence of the feedback loop he had designed. A day later, he received a reply. It was a set of coordinates for a cargo freighter leaving Beacon the next day, bound for the independent outer colonies. No name, no explanation, just a destination. That night, Eris Thorne, xenolinguist and decorated civilian survivor, walked out of the medical wing, his official release papers in his hand. He left behind the medals, the reports, and the comfortable lies of the core worlds. He took nothing with him but the knowledge in his head and the memory of a commander's promise. He found the freighter in a grimy, bustling commercial docking bay. As he walked up the ramp, a familiar figure met him at the top, a compact man with grease-stained hands and weary, knowing eyes. "Took you long enough. Doctor," Kenji Tanaka said with a grim smile. "We've got work to do." Eris stepped aboard, and as the freighter's hatch hissed shut, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the dark days aboard the Stella Seeker. They were a scattered, clandestine fellowship now, bound by a shared, terrible truth. The fleet might not be preparing for the real war, but they would be. They would build on his theory, refine the weapon, and create a symphony of defiance. They would become the silent guardians, listening for the enemy's song, and preparing humanity's answer. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, but for the first time in a long time, the void did not feel empty. It felt expectant, waiting, and Eris Thorn knew, with a certainty that resonated in his very bones, that when the silence came again, they would be ready to scream back.